Welcome creators and designers to the Designer Tech channel, where I, Warwick, will help you with your technology related questions and issues, maybe some coding, to help bring your projects to life. Okay, so this is the first part of a video series on how to programmatically control the Unity user interface layout, and also to manipulate things like TextMesh Pro. This particular video will take the custom component, which is the Resizer, and it will demonstrate how to change the layout, so basically to manipulate the RectTransform of a UI in a very specific way, but it will also show you how to manipulate TextMesh Pro objects specifically to turn on or off the property that controls the font size being automatic. So TextMesh Pro is quite nice. You can automatically make the font size match the bounding box, or for the font size to be fixed, and it will kind of try to adapt it within the bounding box, as in whether it's wrapped around or just sort of static. Okay. So that's what this video is about, and it's part one of a series. Let's take a look at the code now. Okay, so there's two components that I want to talk through on this particular scene. One's called the Resizer and the other one's called the Rescaler, and they just demonstrate slightly different things. But before we get into the actual components, let's have a quick conversation around how I like to set up Unity UI panels, and particularly look at anchors and the pivot and scale and how that changes layout, and then because that has a big difference in terms of how you want to control things and what you want to particularly control in the layout itself, and that plays out in the code as well. So it's an important thing to sort of understand, and then it helps really understand how the RectTransform works, and then when we look at the code, it'll all make a bit more sense. So if I add a new panel just to demonstrate the idea, let's say, yeah, that'll do. I'll do it inside here. So let's just create a panel. First of all, it's worth knowing that when you add a panel like this panel through the menu, this is actually just creating an image object. So that's within the Unity UI. This is just an image object, but because it's set up with certain defaults, so you can see here it's this image component, that's really what it is. It's set up with certain defaults that makes it suitable as a parent for other things like buttons and you know, text fields and things like that. So now let's have a look at how we deal with scale. So you notice first of all that the pivot is 0.5, 0.5. And you can see here that the sort of control point, the position, is right in the middle of this new panel, and that's because of where this pivot is. If we put the pivot at 0, you can see all of a sudden the position control point has gone to the left. If I make it 1, it's all the way to the right. If we can put that back to 0.5, and we make that 1, then that'll be at the top of the panel. And if we make it 0, then it'll be at the bottom of the panel. Now, the reason why that's useful is you may want to pin this panel to say the bottom of its parent. So remember, this is inside this expandable panel here, which is going to be under the control of some code that moves things around. So let's say we want to take this panel and we want to glue it to the bottom of this, so this new panel here. In fact, let's just change the color so it's a bit easier to see what I'm talking about. So the purple panel, let's say we want to sort of bring it in, pin it to the bottom, so it's always 10 pixels from the bottom, no matter what, and it's 10 pixels from the left and right, and the whole thing is maybe 50 pixels tall. So to do that, first of all, I would change the pivot point in terms of the Y to be 0, so that I can control sort of as a reference point the bottom, because the bottom is, you know, what I want to, let's say, it makes it easier if we make the reference the bottom, because my primary concern is that this new panel is going to be 10 pixels from its parent at the bottom. Okay, now the other thing I can do is in terms of the anchors, you can use this anchor presets to set up the anchors, or you could just do it by entering directly into the anchors min and max. And it's the same outcome. Okay, so really what we want is, let's do it visually and then we'll explain what's going on. So for instance here, if I want it to always be centered but pinned to the bottom, then this is the preset to use, right? So if we do this, now we can see that the variables change to be width and height, right? So if I go back to the all directions one, see here, instead of being height and width, you don't have those settings anymore. You just have left, top, right, bottom, which means that the anchors are, and you can see the anchor points up here, the anchors are relative to the parent's left, right, top, bottom, and this is, you can see here, because the anchors here are 0, 0, 1, 1. So it's basically saying of the parent, relative to the parent as a fraction, right? So 0 being the minimum of x will be here at the whatever the parent. So if I change the parent's size, which is going to be a bit annoying, but anyway, let's try to do that. Left, right? So if I make this 20 in, and then I go to the inner panel, you can see it's just adapted to this new size of the parent. It doesn't care. So the parent kind of defines its world when you use the anchors. Okay, so let me just restore that back to what it was. Now, so when we go back to center and bottom, okay, it means that it won't automatically adjust to the parent in terms of the width. So the width will be fixed. So basically, this is a way of telling Unity's UI layout what your concerns are. So for instance, if I want to make it so that it will adapt, right, have a flexible width that adapts to the parent, then I need to set the x, min and max anchors. So if I make this 0 and 1, you'll see the width variable's gone away and we end up with left and right, but the height is still here. And so that means that as the parent panel changes its width, this inner panel, right, let's change its name to the inner panel, it will adapt. It will just automatically adapt. And so what I can do here is if I want to make it 10 from the left and 10 pixels from the right, it's going to automatically adapt, and it's going to put a margin of 10 pixels on either side. Whatever the parent panel happens to be in terms of width, it will just adapt. And knowing that is very powerful because it means that you can set your layouts to be adaptable for different screen sizes. Think mobile when you've got portrait and landscape modes, right, which can switch dynamically, as well as different screen sizes. You know, if it goes to PC on different resolutions, or mobile, so that lets your UI be quite flexible. Okay, so then now I said we wanted 10 pixels from the bottom. So now this position will be kind of driven. It'll be different based on where you do the pivoting, because I want to just think in terms of 10 pixels to make it easy to think about. That's why putting the pivot to the bottom all of a sudden gets easy. So if I say 10 pixels here, we can see that's now 10 pixels in. All right, so we've got a nice margin here, and I think I said I wanted 50 pixels high. So doing that, we now have this lovely panel that's purple, that's sitting at the bottom with a margin of 10 pixels on the left and right and bottom, and it's got a fixed height. So that's the kind of thinking that I bring to the, using the anchors. You can just get that flexibility, and understanding the anchors makes such a big difference for having a flexible UI. And TextMesh Pro is cool. When you use TextMesh Pro text objects or buttons, they can automatically flex their font size and things like that. So again, having that automatic layout, it just becomes so powerful. And that's exactly what we're going to leverage in this kind of code. So now I'll leave that panel there just for fits and giggles. Now, if we look at this expandable panel, let's talk a bit about the resizer. So the resizer, what it's going to do, it's going to adjust the expandable panel, the panel that it is a component on. It's going to adjust it by applying a sine wave. So it applies a sine wave over time. It's driven by the speed variable, but it will also recursively call down all the children, and any TextMesh Pro text objects, it will tell them to either adjust the font size automatically or not. Right? And all that's really doing is, if you go to one of the TextMesh Pro objects, you can see when it comes to, where is it? Here it is. So the font size setting, you can either have a fixed font size, or you can click this auto size, and it will just adapt the size of the font according to the size of the box that contains it, which is a cool feature. Okay, so if we hit play, right, give it a second. There we go. All right, so we can see that we can see a few things happening. We can see that the pink panel or the purple panel, it's maintaining, it's adapting perfectly, just like we said, because it's using the anchors. It's being bound by its parent, and it's using the 10 pixel margin, and that's working exactly as we talked about. We can see that the if I click on one of the text objects, text object, the containing box is changing, but the font size is fixed. If I click auto size on that one, we can see that the text size is now changing vertically and horizontally according to that boundary. If I untick that, in fact, you can even see in the inspector that it's changing. So if I untick that, it stays at a fixed 50. If I go back to the resizer, right, we can do a few things here. I can change this right max, right min. So this should be in pixels. So if I make this 150, it should go a little bit further out. If I make it 500, it should, oh, actually, you know what? I need to restart it to get it to pick up those values. Stop. Now try. See how it's now moving a whole lot further out, right? So it's just changing, in fact, you can see it here, it's changing that right value, right? So the number of pixels. So it's still being bound by its parent's region, and you can see the anchor is still there in exactly the same spot, but it's using the number of pixels to go further right by. That's what's happening in this sort of right edge control. Now, that looks quite crazy, but you know, that might be exactly the effect you want for whatever reason. And of course, if we make it something within the margin and maybe make this 1, it'll be a much smaller change. Right, so it's sort of just barely rippling. Okay, so what else can we do? The other thing I have set up here is, like I said, the ability to change the font size. So let's just see what that looks like. Here, so let's put this back to what it was, 110. Play. So now if I do this auto size text and tick that on, we can see that it has pushed that setting down to all of the text objects, and they're all adapting accordingly. Okay, so you can see that happening there. Okay, so we'll have a look at the code and see how the code is achieving this. So now that we understand some of the points around using anchors for layout and how to use these offsets, these are basically the offsets. And if you look up just as a point as well, if we look up the Unity scripting reference, actually, is what I'm after, and go to Unity Engine, under classes, and scroll all the way down to RectTransform. Here we go. we'll see that we have things like anchor min, anchor max, which represent anchor min here and anchor max there, and then things like the pivot, which is obviously the pivot here, and the offset min and max, which represent these offsets here, not the Z, but specifically the left, top, right, bottom. The other thing to notice is the anchor position, and so if you change, let's see if we go here to this one, because we have the, which one is it? It's the Y, anchors in the Y direction, both being the same, then position comes in the Y direction, not in the X. Left and right are still offsets, but in the Y direction that's position. And so that means this anchor position property is in play here. So that's what's going on there, and then you'll have the size delta also having a play for the height. So that means that it's sort of a contextual, it's a contextual sort of control that you have. You know, you kind of need to understand how the anchors work and how that triggers a different behavior. So the code that I have here takes that into account to a degree, and we can see this. What I've done here is I've got the 3 components which are used in the different scenes, but then I have these utility classes, and so a lot of the work is actually done in the utility classes. So if we look at the RectTransform util, we can see here that we have methods like set position and anchor, fix size and set position, which are kind of changing mode between using anchor-based layout versus a position-based layout. So that's how this is done. Now, just to continue explaining some of the ideas, and then we'll have a deeper look at the code and the way I've structured it. There's one example I wanted to show. So what if we hit play? Right, so we're going to get, of course, it's going to start moving on the right-hand side, or the right side of this expandable panel is expanding and contracting all the time, which we can see here. See this right value? So if I just disable the Resizer component, then I can do this here manually. You know, I can put in from -10 up to, you know, +10, and we can see this is an offset, so a positive value is pushing it in. So if I make this 30, you can see here it's actually, Unity's editor actually shows you how, you know, this is the number of pixels between the anchor and the edge of the panel. If we make it more like something we can't miss, like 50, we can see that's definitely pressed in quite a bit. And if we make it -50, then it will go past its parent. So that's really what the Resizer is doing. So the Resizer is just adjusting this one value, which we can see, of course, by re-enabling the component, right? That's the only thing it's changing. But because it's changing that, the children of that object get impacted. And they do so because, let me pause that again. Yeah. They get impacted because if we look at, okay, this key message TextMesh Pro object here, we can see that I'm using all anchors to define the position of this object within its parent, right? Which means that as this thing expands and contracts, right, this thing is also expanding and contracting, and that's because this left side is literally 0.02 of whatever the parent panel is, right? It's 0.02 in, its height, it stops at 0.8, height starts at 0.8, which starts here, this is the lower end, and ends at 0.95, which is up there, and the right hand side is 0.3. So it means that this point is 0.3 in, like 0.3 of the parent in. So if this is, say, 100 pixels across, this would be, from this edge, that would be 30 pixels in. And this would be 2 pixels in if it was 100 pixels wide. So that's why this is moving, like as the parent is changing size, which I can do manually here. Hang on, I grab it a certain way. Right, yeah, come on. Oh, that doesn't work anymore. I must have changed that. So as we do this, this is literally changing size. So again, the easiest way to see that is, sorry, go back here, re-enable the resizer, and we can look at this guy. Nothing's changing here because it's all relative to the parent. But in actual, but in effect, this is actually changing its size, literally, in pixel terms. Okay. Now, what could we do to change that? If I make the min and max the same, and then I'll have an opportunity to set the width, and that will stop happening. So, just to drive this point home, if I make this, say, 0.15 and 0.15, and now, let's see, oh, no, I didn't want that. Leave that as 0.8. I keep doing that. X is here. I wanted to make X the same. Okay, so now I have a fixed width, and so this actually isn't changing its width. If I make it, say, 400, it's changing its position, but not its width. If instead we do, if I make the pivot is 0, if I make this 0 and 0, now it's not changing at all, right? So the difference was when I had it as, say, 0.1, it was fixed width, but this distance, this left-hand distance, was still relative to the parent, right? So that distance was changing. It's like a percentage of the parent offset, right? That's what this effectively achieves. If we make it 0, then it's not relative to the parent at all, and it's completely driven by this position X value, which when we look at the documentation for the RectTransform is literally this anchor position. So we could make this 50, and we can see as we change it around, it's moving literally in. And because the pivot is 0, that 60 is relative to this left-hand side. If they make the pivot 0.5, Unity adjusts this for us to keep it all in the same place, but now this is 253.5 pixels from here to here. Right, and if I want to make that, say, 200 pixels, we can see that's 200 pixels from where it's anchored at the 0 point all the way to this to the pivot point. So this all works based on either a combination of the anchor position, the anchor itself, the pivot, and potentially the offsets, depending on whether you're position driven or offset and anchor driven. Okay, now let's have a look at the code and see a bit more of how this works. So back to the Resize, excuse me. So we have a few variables which we can see in the Unity editor when I click on the right object. So the expandable panel here is the one that has the resizer on it. We have right max, right min, and speed, as well as the auto size text. We can see here, first of all, we're importing the TextMesh Pro namespace. And half the trick is finding the documentation, at least the way it's done in the package. It's sort of not so easy. Actually, the good news is when you import TextMesh Pro, just by the way, you actually get the source code. So you've got your documentation here. That's another thing that's worth looking at. So hang on. So this is probably the better documentation. And in fact, to be fair, I haven't really looked at this as much as what was online. But also you get the source code. It's under packages. Come on. Where are you? TextMesh Pro. And you should actually find runtime. There's the source code there. So it is possible to sort of have a deeper look and see how this all works. Okay. So what do we have? Okay, so we have our variables, the right max, right min. So that's just defining, the range of the drift of the right hand side. We have the speed, which we can vary, and we have this auto size text, which is just an outright setting of true or false. Now, so one of the utility things is this change trigger. The change trigger is, the idea is that you have an object that can call a method when the value changes, and the reason why I do this is I wanted to have a trade-off between the flexibility of being able to change a value without always causing lots of calls in Unity while it renders, because that can essentially slow things down. I didn't want to impact performance. So this achieves that. So here I register a handler, which when there's a change in value, this will get called to deal with that. So here basically when the auto size text variable changes, we will get this will get called, and it will push that setting all the way down to all of the TextMesh Pro objects. So that's really what's going on here. This enable auto sizing is effectively this auto size toggle. So in fact we can see that. So if I hit play, if we go up here, in fact now let's start with this, we can see that it is not on either one. I go up here, auto size text is off. Now if I hit true there, we can see they are auto sizing in terms of the font size, and we go here and we can see sure enough the auto size is on. So that's what's happening here. This is propagating or pushing down that change. This is the property that it needs to change, enable auto sizing. So that's what's being pushed down. Okay, so it's actually a relatively simple script. So at start it's just setting up the change trigger, it's getting the component references, setting up the right hand values, and it's updating the text state, which is pushing down the auto size text as the initial setting. And then every frame it does this update check, which basically it's taking whatever happens to be the latest value that was set through the editor in case you change it, and it updates the change trigger. And only if that is a different value will it cause this to be called. So if it doesn't change, then there's no further work done, and that's the optimization, the performance optimization. We can see here we're using sine involving the speed to get the variation, right? So that should go from -1 to +1, and then we're using that to compute an offset here, and then based on that offset that gets computed, we set the right hand side. So that basically explains how that whole thing works. So that's setting the right hand side by changing the RectTransform's offset max, which is literally offset max. It'll be the in fact yes, there we are, that's what I was after. It's the x value of offset max, which is right, which is literally this value here. Offset max, yes. So that is really how this whole thing's working, and which is of course why when we hit play we see this right value changing. Okay, so that was an overview and a bit of a tour through the Resizer and how that component works and some of the utility classes that make it up. Remember, there's a GitHub project. The link to the project will be in the description for the video. You'll be able to download the code and try it yourself, maybe try to follow along and so forth, and see how the utility classes work and how the Resizer works. This bit was a bit simple, and there's more interesting things coming. So, by all means, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out the following videos in the series. I think you'll get a bit more from the next two videos in the series. But thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, by all means, give me some feedback. If you have some questions, just put some comments in with maybe things you want to ask about, or if you have an idea for something that's worth exploring that would help you with your creative project.